This evening I'm joined by three fantastic GPs, and we are tonight talking about what the new NHS bill that's passing through Parliament at the moment means for medical professionals and for regular patients like you and me. First of all, which of you, the guests I've got are Bob Gill, who's a GP, Yusuf Al-Gengahay, who's also a GP, and he's written a fantastic book called How to Dismantle the NHS in 10 Easy Steps, and I recommend everyone has a read of it. And we've got Dr. Kailash Chand, who's also a retired GP and NHS campaigner. So which of you would like to go first to describe what's happening with this new bill?
Let me just start it just with a few words. You see, I think in my working life, I've seen almost 5 major reforms. There have been so many, but 5, in my view, were major reforms. And the roadmap been literally for last almost 30 years, in which the universal healthcare is not acceptable to a particular lobby of the politicians. And they, in my view, now taking us to that road to ultimate goal. Ultimate goal is that it turns out to be a Kaiser kind of permanent US type of healthcare, where ultimately it's insurance system. So I have my real concern. This is what the ultimate goal is, to literally have a privatized or insured healthcare system. And it is the recipe, again, for huge corruption. We have seen it, what exactly has happened in the pandemic. And they were trying to sell this. We are removing that one of the clause in Lansley reforms, clause 75, asking tendering and all that, so that now it's much easier for them to pass it on to private sector as easily as they want to.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this bill comes off the back of a number of reforms that have taken place, I think Bob and Yusuf have both say over the last 40 years, but under successive governments. But this one possibly could present a real challenge to the future of the NHS altogether. What you mentioned Section 75, Kailash. Can you explain for people watching what exactly Section 75 means?
Section 75 essentially was that you got to tender for any service you want to provide. So there was the requirement of tendering for that service. And that again had a lot of bureaucratic kind of problems, particularly with the hospital services as well as the GP services. So BMA particularly was very much against it, that this is not the right one. But in my view, the whole thing is wrong. Just picking one thing up doesn't serve the purpose. That's what they're doing. They're removing this on and saying, yeah, this is what you wanted, and we're giving it to you. So it was essentially a process of what exactly the capitalist system does or the corporate system does by having the tenders for particular services, and they want to really now remove it and literally make it much smoother, more or less, for the private sector to enter in.
Yeah, totally. I mean, Yusuf, you're a bit of an expert on the journey of the NHS from a publicly provided service to privatisation. How do you see this bill in the context of the bills that went before it?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kailash is definitely got his finger on the key issue, which is that you've got to contextualise this within a much bigger narrative that goes back to at least to the Thatcher era, in which we've gradually seen the NHS being converted from a public system, meaning publicly run, publicly owned, publicly funded. Some of that is obviously still the case, large parts even, but gradually converting that into an NHS market. And this, if you like, is arguably the final step in that process, which is to convert the NHS into a US healthcare model known as integrated care. And unfortunately, integrated care is being used as a PR buzzword. So it's being sold as integration of care between various NHS services, between the NHS and social care or local government. And that's obviously sounds very attractive, sounds very enticing to various constituencies. Who's going to argue with that? But actually integrated care is a technical term, and it's a US healthcare term, which goes by various other synonyms such as managed care or accountable care. And you only have to look at how that operates in the US, to see what we are facing, or in fact, in many ways is already here, which is a two-tier system, one in which those who can afford healthcare or are more affluent are going to have a different, much superior quality of healthcare to those who can't, who will be left with a much more basic, inferior NHS. I don't think the NHS per se will be abolished. What it will become is the equivalent of kind of Medicare in the US.
Yeah, of course, health costs are the biggest cause of bankruptcy in the United States. In their system, it's actually costing more for the US administration to work through their system. The government are spending more money on the American system, despite there being insurance policies in place for a lot of the citizens, than we spend here in the UK, where no insurance policies are required at all. But it's not just an issue of funding, is it? It's a much bigger issue. Do you want to come in on that, Bob?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the public discourse around funding is misleading. One of the problems with marketizing the NHS has been to divert money away from the delivery of care. So we see that the market bureaucracy has mushroomed. The amount of money going on lawyers and accountants is accounting for about 10%. This is a modest estimate, 10% of the NHS budget. In America, the overheads are around 36%. So $1 in every three goes out in bureaucracy, administration, and don't forget profit and CEO bonuses. And what the new bill does, in its first paragraph, it calls the NHS to be no longer a provider. So we're going to get away with this purchaser provider split. The NHS will just become a budget, and the rest of it will be totally privately provided. This is a big step in the wrong direction. The integrated care boards will be dominated by private corporations. In fact, the legislation is only making legal what has been happening in shadow form for over a decade. So going back to 2006, under New Labour, there were reforms bringing in what they called world-class commissioning, and they had a whole array of private corporations who were going to do the commissioning. And you had GPs as a fig leaf of clinical cover. But the reality is the entrepreneurial GPs who were fronting these changes had actually zero impact on the decisions that were made. So this has been going on for over a decade, and the legislation gives it legal footing and potentially irreversible if we enter into an American US trade deal with the UK. The other problem with the bill is that it doesn't talk about general practice. General practice as we know it will cease to exist. GPs over time will become salaried and part of the integrated care system. So you will have an organization covering a population of 2 to 3 million, within which you will throw in social care, what's left of public social care. The integration they're looking to achieve is integration of budgets. And within that will incorporate all the staff working in the hospitals and working in the community. And there will be an end to national pay bargaining. There will be a further downward pressure on the pay of the staff. And we saw this with the pay freeze for doctors and nurses since 2010. We saw the attack on the junior doctors in 2016. So we have a workforce which is primed, made very cheap and compliant, ready for the corporate masters to take over.
It's very worrying indeed. I mean, putting it in the context of 40 years of deliberate sabotage on our NHS, which I think we would all agree we've witnessed, the last 11 years or so have seen probably the biggest, most bold attacks on the NHS. And as a campaigner, I think that the degree to which they're doing harm to our most trusted institution in this country makes it very difficult for the general public to understand the scale of robbery that's happening. Bob, you've obviously made a couple of films about one called Sell Off and the other one called The Great NHS Heist, which anyone watching this, please look them up on YouTube. They're really informative. But the 2012 Act, let's take it back to the beginning of the heady days of the coalition government. The 2012 Health and Social Care Act has a number of issues in it. And in that legislation, the first part was it removed the legal requirement for the Secretary of State for Health to provide a health service, which was absolutely remarkable as far as we could see as activists. Its one saving grace was Section 75, which, as Kailash has already mentioned, is going to be withdrawn in this bill. And we've seen throughout the last year the problems with government ministers awarding contracts for health services and where that money's gone and who's profited from it. And we only have to look at the well, they call it NHS track and trace. It's anything but NHS track and trace. It's Serco track and trace. Let's call it what it is. If it was provided by the NHS and rolled out by the NHS using publicly funded staff, I'm pretty sure we would have seen a much more effective solution to the problems we're facing. They, you know, the NHS have done a wonderful job of the vaccine rollout, despite what's been done to them by this current government. So merging NHS healthcare with social care does really sound like an excellent idea, because what we've seen through the pandemic is people being released from hospital into care homes. So for the sake of the people listening, which one of you would like to explain why it's a problem to merge those two sectors of our healthcare?
Bonnie, very quickly, it's just a utopia. Just look at the social care. Social care is mean tested and social care is mostly private sector. So if you merge that, a mean tested actually attacks your universal health care, and the whole thing is with the private sector. So that means social care and NHS so-called merge becomes essentially a bonanza for the private sector. So I think that's what perhaps the people got to understand. And even I think it's only today Boris Johnson has come with this so-called his reforms or social care paper he wanted to be as soon as possible is now postponed to next autumn, I think. This is what is happening. So they don't know, they have no clue what they're going to do with the social care. And people got to understand that. Let me make another point also. I think that our colleagues are particularly professional got to understand the main thrust of this particular legislation is to deprofessionalize and downskill the profession. The medicine is going to be deprofessionalized and downscaling. What it means is that instead of, as Bob was very rightly saying, instead of having GPs, you will have physician assistants, or even hospital sector also, you won't have the consultants looking after it. You will have so downgraded. As a matter of fact, we now are almost 10,000 GP short and several thousand consultants short. They're not bothered about it because they don't need any more GPs. They don't need even consultants for that reason. For that reason, I think professions got to be really worried that the whole thrust is going to be profit making, and profit making is by downscaling the salaries, downscaling the income you give to the staff. So I think that's, in my view, is real worry. Social care is a utopia, it's never be merged. And so in a way, it will become a private provider's bonanza. And whole thing in this integrated care system is everything is given to the private provider sector, and provider sector also with a limited budget. And then the limited budget, they will decide what kind of treatment can be given. And then now just look at the scenario. Nobody anticipated this pandemic. Now this pandemic will make things much easier and better for this kind of legislation when you have a waiting list of 5.1 million officially, and unofficially this is going to even 10-15 millions. So what will happen is they want to win votes. They would want to see this waiting list are sorted out very quickly. So who does that? The private sector comes in, and things will be much easier and better. I don't know how public got to get to this, that the whole thing, by the time this thing is over and done with, NHS is gone. And NHS once gone will never come back.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the question I think that the general public need to ask themselves is, when they've got coronavirus, when they've been in an accident, if they've got a broken bone or if they've got something else wrong with them, who do they want to prescribe what should happen to them, prescribe their care? An accountant or a GP or a consultant? You know, we're heading towards this world where accountancy is king, and forget the professional qualifications of the people looking after you. As qualified teacher myself, I've seen exactly the same attacks that are rolling out on the NHS go through our education system, much like the development of trusts and ACOs or integrated care, whatever you want to call them. We've seen local authority schools transfer to academy trusts. And in academy trusts, they don't have to have any representatives from the local community. They're not answerable to the Department for Education. They're not answerable to the local electorate. And they've introduced classroom assistants who are gradually taking over the jobs of qualified teachers. It's a disservice to our children, and this is exactly what they're doing in our NHS. We saw the sell-off of school playing fields once schools became academy trusts and those playing fields turned into luxury development apartments. We're seeing it in our hospitals as well. As soon as they can downgrade our local hospitals, the land that they once stood on is being sold off for very exclusive apartments to be built on them. So we've seen it happen once to our education. We know what's coming, and we need to stand up absolutely against it. What have you seen as a GP, Yusuf? How are you seeing these reforms hitting you?
Yeah, I mean, this used to be a kind of question that you'd be fielded and seemed, a decade ago, quite difficult to answer that question. But it's becoming increasingly apparent the effects of all this, particularly the gradual piecemeal dismantling of the NHS. We've obviously touched on waiting lists, but I guess that's kind of a historical trend that fluctuates depending on which government is in power often, and the possibly other conditions. But really what I've noticed that's very stark, and perhaps when I was working in the East End and in Tower Hamlets, it was obscured, having moved to, I guess, somewhere more affluent, which is in North Oxfordshire. It's very clear that the number of people who now have private healthcare cover, and so quite a significant number of patients, I wouldn't say it's a majority, but there's a significant segment who clearly have private cover either individually or through their work. And they are therefore, when they're being referred, they're asking to be referred to obviously through that to a private provider. So that's becoming very clear as a trend. Whilst if you obviously haven't got that, you're relying on, to take one specialty in our area, ear, nose and throat, those services have been basically suspended locally. They have to be referred out of area. The waiting lists are something like 1 year. So, that's just, it's extraordinary and it's abysmal, shocking. But the problem is that for the public, from their point of view, in terms of their perception and in terms of the quality of debate in the public sphere and in the media particularly, is that this just looks like the NHS isn't working. Sometimes the debate gets as far as saying, well, it's funding or it's, deliberate certain policies, but there is a complete lack of understanding about the fact that this is the product of decades of reforms turning the NHS into a market, and that when you do that, when you turn healthcare, or for that matter, other public services, you've touched on education, into a market, you end up with a certain set of certain situations, certain set of conditions in which you have squeezed budgets, you have cuts, you have austerity, you have a gradual denigration of and dismantling of the quality of that service, you have deprofessionalization, de-skilling. And that's exactly what's happening in the NHS, it's what's happening in education. And there's no debate about really those issues in the mainstream, about the fact that the root cause of this is a set of deregulated free market reforms that are centered on privatisation, on outsourcing, on low taxation, budget cuts, and financialisation, which is turning public assets into financial instruments to profit a small elite. So Kailash has touched on social care. That's happened in the space of about a generation. In the space of 25 years, social care has gone from being mainly publicly owned to a situation where I think a third of it is still public, a third is owned by small businesses, and a third is owned by large chains, which are often owned by financial institutions such as private equity and hedge funds. And of course, that's the direction that we are now heading in for healthcare. That's the worrying thing when you look at networks of GP surgeries, chains of super hospitals that are coming down the road. Those are basically, you're creating, in terms of the structure, the architecture of integrated care, you are creating economies of scale that are going to be enticing for private equity, for hedge funds, for multinationals, and for private healthcare and insurance companies.
Yeah, that's a big issue, isn't it? I'm pretty sure anyone watching this will have experienced increased difficulties in actually getting access to their GP through this crisis. And obviously, for understandable reasons, a lot of GP appointments have switched to telephone consultations. But this is off the back of a number of mergers of GP practices. My own practice, which was very small and it was run from the dining room of a house down the road sort of thing, is now a medical practice. And the chances of getting seen more than once once by the same doctor in that practice is all, it's almost unheard of. And if you want to book an appointment, the waiting time is sometimes as much as 7 or 8 weeks. Now, I can't book in when I'm going to be sick, nor can I book in when my kids are going to be sick. It's becoming increasingly difficult as a patient to get a GP appointment. What is your experience on your side of what's happening there?
I mean, I think that's, I've heard these reports. Luckily, where I work, that's not the case. But that comes down to the ethos of where you work, or even, whether it's we're still a traditional family-run practice, as I think Bob's is. But if you're looking at these bigger practices, we've got one down the road, these kind of super GP practices where there's been a merger. I've spoken to, a friend of mine who lives in the area, and, they phone up and they're kind of 70 something on the list. And in the end, they've just left the practice because it is untenable, of course, in terms of good patient care. But this is, of course, used to then beat the NHS and to beat GPs round the head with, and to say this is your fault. And so you get this very kind of polarized, toxic, divisive debate. And you see this on social media where people are having a go at GPs. You see it, of course, in the Telegraph, the Mail, that GPs who already were set up back in the New Labour era as kind of fat cats, even though obviously only a minority were these kind of entrepreneurial types, as Bob has highlighted, and now being castigated and denigrated. And so it's very clever, the kind of strategies that are being deployed in order to bring about this. And I think this comes down to ideology, comes down to public consciousness. And if people obviously through propaganda and through other means are unable to understand the root causes of what's happening to the NHS, that's going to be the end result, is that we end up mired in these kind of polarized, toxic debates where there's no real understanding of what's going on for a significant segment of the population, and they vote for someone like Boris Johnson, and they think that he's going to, this man who is from a class point of view is the complete opposite of what the majority of the country is in terms of what the needs of working class voters are. And they think that this man's going to deliver the kind of change that they want, because right now the status quo isn't working on every level in terms of stagnant wages and living standards, cost of living, overstretched public services, all of these things. And so when people voted for Trump, or they voted for Brexit, or they voted for Johnson, they thought they were voting for transformation, for change. But of course, Boris Johnson's, when you actually look at his writing, when you look at his quotes, when you look at his policies, of course, and thankfully the main opposition seems to be coming right now from internal rifts. I mean, that's a tragic kind of situation, that's what we're relying on. But the main opposition right now is Dominic Cummings. And if anyone had been listening to, of course, the Today programme this morning, they would know that one of the things that happened, and we've heard a whole succession of these things, of these revelations, but one of the things that happened was that Boris Johnson said that he didn't buy the whole thing about the NHS being overwhelmed or overstretched, and he was sick of it, and that was the reason that he delayed the autumn lockdown, and of course that led to a catastrophic second wave with 80,000 deaths. So that's the situation. I keep jumping, I'm afraid, from one area to the next, but that's what we are dealing with, and I think maybe it's going to take the catastrophic failures. Maybe things have to get a lot worse before they get better. I suppose that might be the only way, tragically.
Yeah, the problem is I don't think we can afford for that to happen.
No, of course
Kailash, do you want to come in?
Well, I just very quick one. I think Bob will perhaps want to say a lot more than what I'll say. The truth is, we are blaming the Tories for what exactly is happening. But in my view, the whole process of this decade started with the modernization agenda of NHS. If people remember that, right from Tony Blair and Alan Milgram's day. And look at Darcy, what Darcy was doing. Darcy was actually downgrading the hospitals and was closing the surgeries. The so-called Darcy polyclinics and all that was a plan to literally almost obliterate your district general hospitals, have 30 hospitals, and the surgeries again merged. What we're now seeing restarted at the polyclinics anyway. So I think let's not just attack a particular political party. It's a policy which is wedded to by both the parties, and I think we've got to attack it that way.
Yeah, I mean, don't misunderstand me. I absolutely concur with that view. It's just we've had a Tory-led or Tory government for 11 years, so that's the reason I'm focused on them. But you're absolutely right. Of course, I'm not. And this is one of the tricks that's used, is that the debate is this black and white debate that's presented between Conservative and Labour. Of course, under Corbyn, there was the possibility of a genuine break from this neoliberal consensus, but with Starmer, with obviously his predecessors such as Blair and Brown, it was a very similar agenda that's been in the works, in the pipeline for 20, 30 years. And this comes back to the current bill, which is now being presented, this is PR again, as a break, that this is a clean break from the competition and market agenda. And of course, it's nothing of the kind. It is the logical perpetuation, the logical extension of that process. By getting rid of competition, you're actually consolidating privatisation.
Yes, I quite often in my talk say that had Alan Milburn not done what he did to NHS, frankly, dare not, I think public would have been much more clear and conscious about it, what exactly is happening. I think the whole process, in my view, was started by Blair and Alan Milburn.
Could I come in and just point out the elephant in the room I don't think we've covered yet? If you've got any awareness of what's going on behind the scenes in the NHS, there's one company, one corporation that people should get familiar with, and that corporation is United Health. Their subsidiary is Optum in the UK. They are the biggest American private health insurer, and they are entrenched within the NHS already, and they have been building up a presence over the past decade. The creation of these new integrated care systems will in fact be able to hand over control. Remember, the NHS won't be a provider anymore. It will just be a budget, an income stream. The control of that income stream is going to be handed over to an American private insurer. Now that should be ringing alarm bells. What does this mean day to day? Well, only today a patient of mine developed gallstone cholecystitis. He's had 2 bouts, and he came into me saying, can I do a letter, because he's going to have to dip into his life savings to pay for his operation. So he's looking at spending £7,000 to get an operation quick, because he's worried about becoming very seriously ill. At the hospital level or the urgent care centre level, you have overstretched staff working beyond their competence, delivering poor care. What does that mean? It means patients who are seriously ill get misdiagnosed and sent home. And I have lost several patients. Certainly many have been harmed, but several have died as a direct result of misdiagnosis in busy A&Es with lack of supervision for junior staff. And that's what keeps me motivated. What does it mean for the staff? Well, you're not getting the training, you're not getting the supervision, you're working outside of your competence. This is extremely stressful. And if you do damage someone, there's that chronic moral injury that they are suffering. So who's the victims here? The taxpayers getting ripped off, the patients are getting a raw deal, and the staff are being chronically tormented working in dangerous environments. Who's winning? The City of London, American corporations, and people connected to the governments, and politicians who have no real sort of core principles other than their own personal progression and enrichment. So this is a fight, irrespective of which party you belong to, which should unify most of us. Even 70% of Tory voters believe in the NHS, and that's what we need to unify. The idea of people realizing that they've been hoodwinked all these years and this money is going to be given over to an American insurer, I think will alarm most people.
And another thing which I think, sorry,
Kailash, go on.
Another thing which we need to highlight is the central plank of these reforms is so-called 42 ICS. Now, think of it, each ICS will have its own budget, and they will determine what kind of services that ICS will provide. So that means we will have not a so-called NHS, which we always talk about. It will be fragmented into 42 so-called regions. In a way, that is perhaps the most worrying thing. Postcode lottery, that's what real postcode lottery would be. And one thing will be available in one ICS, won't be available in another one. So the whole concept of universal healthcare is defeated in this so-called, they talk about integrated care. It's not integrated care, it's a fragmented care. with 42 regions, 42 budgets, 42 different ways of providing those things is the real nightmare in my view.
And that's really, really important. For example, in my local NHS trust, they rationed fertility treatment for people. And at the same time they rationed that treatment for people, which is a really important thing for a lot of people who are struggling. The same week they did that, Robert Winston Smith came into the hospital to open a new private fertility clinic, which means if you can pay for it, you can have it. But if you need it, and if you pay your taxes and you haven't got thousands of pounds to spare, it's tough. Now that is completely unacceptable as far as I can see.
Yeah.
Welcome, Nico. It's good to be joined by you. Did you want to come in on this as well? I know this is a...
Well, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what you've said and not haven't said, so I've just bust in. But I know kind of points. Cut me off if like you've already covered it. I guess were you talking about the debate and how it went in Parliament?
Well, we're talking at the moment about budgets and the 42 footprints.
Yeah, I mean, what's just really catches my attention is the principle of encouraging bodies to provide less care, or paying them more to provide less. It's in Bookill's film, and you see it having come from, it's the model, it's the US model that they're currently calling integrated care. And it's striking that, a few years ago there was a survey among MPs, and most of them didn't understand what NHS England was talking about. In its jargon, which really isn't designed to be clear about what it's about. It's been in broad daylight, but in such a way that it passes just below the radar for most people, what's been going on there. And so yeah, I'm struck by that, and I'd like to do it. Hopefully soon I'll do a little piece about that using clips of how that has been the aim throughout, from the Tory internal market through the Blair's policies that he developed with US corporations through today, has been that model of restricting, moving away from Kailash mentions universal and comprehensive care towards a much more restricted menu. And what that means basically you're pushed to go private if you can, and if you can't, you don't. So I'm just going to throw in a few points and see how it works out. But really important to get that this is the legislation. Sorry if I'm going off a bit from what you were talking about. The legislation rubber stamp stuff that's happened a lot. A lot of it's already happened without a debate, without a law behind it, and that's not being talked about a lot, as much as it should be. And also, I wanted to point out John Ashworth was at pains to try and pretend that this wasn't the rubber stamping of Stephen's plans. He said, this isn't Stephen's plans, this is something else. The bad thing about it isn't Stephen's plans, Simon Stephen's plans. It's some other things that the Tories have done. And he pointed out what he called a power grab. Now, when the state took over healthcare, in a power grab or a top-down reorganisation was in 1948, his tone is antagonistic to the idea of an NHS when he does it, just as David Cameron was when he complained about a top-down reorganisation. And anyway, so I just want to draw it back to the fact this is Simon Stephen's plans, and for years and years he's been saying we're going to need some legislation to sort of seal this in once it's already a done deal, which is completely undemocratic. There was a debate about this when Diane Abbott called a opposition debate on sustainability and transformation plans. Otherwise, we've not really been invited to consider whether we want to close, to leave each of one of these ITSs with ideally one acute hospital and nothing more than that, and so on and so on. So anyway, I've thrown a few things in. I'll let you carry on because.
Thank you. I just wanted to draw out a couple of points in there. I've been, as a Labour Party activist and candidate a couple of times in general elections, I've been incredibly frustrated by a lot of the front bench on the Labour side making the debate for the NHS about getting more funding. Now, of course, the NHS needs more funding, but the real problem is where that funding is spent. It's seen the real term cuts for a number of years, but what we're seeing now is the reduced budget for the NHS is increasingly going to private providers and therefore satisfying their shareholders. And then when you've got shareholders, directors, accountants, corporate bosses and so on, taking their fee from all of this, the more reduced the bill is for actually spending on the care for the patients that are paying for it. So, Bob, did you want to tell us more about what the budget cuts mean for you in your practice, or the real-term budget cuts mean for you in your practice?
Yeah, well, the range of services, the timeliness of services, the quality of services has diminished. There's no getting away from that. If people need support in their own homes, well, we've had a 40% cut in social services funding. So, we are forced as GPs to attend various meetings to tick boxes on safeguarding, this, that, and the other, and mental health and awareness week. You have all these attempts to gaslight us when a lot of the problems originate in government. The government is causing problems that they are pretending to fix. So, we're constantly bombarded with propaganda and brainwashing. But the reality on the ground is the only reason the NHS is still functioning is largely on the goodwill, perseverance, and superhuman efforts of the people working in it. Now, that's not everybody, of course. There is a significant minority who are cashing up with all of this. The people on the boards, the people fighting to be on the boards, the people who have gone around merging practices and selling them on to companies like Centene. So we mustn't think everybody with a doctor title in front of their name is a saint. There are many doctors, I won't name any of them tonight, who have done very well out of this. And they often provide clinical smokescreen that this is done in the public interest. It isn't. To boil it down, it's about redirecting your taxes into the pockets of shareholders and chief executive bonuses. That's what it is. It's a massive siphoning scam. And we're going to pay for it with our lives. That's the problem.
Yeah.
I think John Trickett called it right in the debate that happened on this bill the other day. We should never put a person's wealth over another person's health, and that's what we're getting to now. I can remember as an activist having street stalls saying they're stealing our NHS from under our noses. Why can't you see it? I can remember people coming up to me on the street stall saying, well, the NHS is rubbish. Now, that is the deliberate design of the government to make it, as you said earlier, Bob, to make it look like it's the doctors that are not performing properly. And then I'd have other people saying, yeah, it's rubbish, so I've got private healthcare now because I can't be going down that route anymore. But the point that I would urge everyone to consider is you might be able to afford your private healthcare insurance now when it's a luxury, it's an optional extra to your life. What happens when that is all you've got, when everybody needs to take out private healthcare insurance, should we ever get there, and I hope we don't, those private healthcare insurance companies will not keep the prices where they are. They will go through the roof. And this is all coinciding with a data grab on all of our health records as well. I don't know how many people watching this might have noticed, but there was a plan to release all of our medical data to private, well, to whoever wants it really. And if that goes to private healthcare insurance companies, then they can see that you've got, let's say, a history of depression. Are they going to be interested in taking you on, or will they charge you a premium to have insurance with them? Well, I think we know the answer there, don't we? So you've all of you doctors here, you've all experienced people going private rather than going through the NHS. How does that leave other patients who can't afford that? Are they able to get through the waiting list any faster? Because it used to be an argument, I remember back in the 90s, well, if you can afford to go private, at least you're coming out of the waiting list and NHS patients can get seen. Is that what's actually happening, or is that just another myth?
It's a bit simplistic, and one doesn't cancel out the other, because don't forget, all the time, in order to drive people into the private sector, they continue to shrink NHS capacity. So there is nowhere else to go. And massive multi-billion-pound contracts are being handed out to private hospital chains as we speak. Let's not forget that during the pandemic, if the taxpayer hadn't stepped in, a lot of these hospitals would have gone bust. So we have subsidized their very survival. They provided very little in the way of helping out with the pandemic. And now they're strengthened to come and cherry pick all the easy, straightforward operations out of the NHS. So it's a false argument, it's a diversion. But in terms of, let's not forget how insurance works. Insurers want people who don't get ill. insurers want people without medical problems. If you do have pre-existing problems, don't worry, you're going to pay for it through your premiums. And if you do become seriously sick, they'll look at the small print of your policy and look at your medical notes and come up with reasons not to pay. That's how the business model works. So having insurance, you may feel smug and covered, but it won't be there when you really need it, and certain treatments will be cash limited. Your cancer treatment might stop after £500,000. You will have to then fund it yourself. So the reason the people going bankrupt in the States for medical bills, the vast majority of them had private health insurance. It is a total myth that private health is there to give you lovely 5-star treatment. Soon as you become expensive, they look for ways to drop you like a brick.
It is really, really worrying. Going back to the integrated care model, you talking about that, Bob, just reminded me of a friend of mine whose father developed dementia. And in order to pay for his care, her mother had to sell their family home, make herself homeless, so that they could fund the care that he needed. Absolutely disgraceful. If that is the model, are they really going to be expecting me to sell my house if one of my kids gets in a car accident, shall we say? Probably yes, if we go down this integrated care system. So until we get social care properly publicly provided with no reference to a person's income or wealth, I think it's really lethal to try and combine those two services. Looking back over the original NHS bill, there were, of course, many more services that we were entitled to, like dentistry and eye care and so on. NHS dentists, try and find one, first of all. And the next thing is, when you do get to an NHS dentist, the costs rack up so quickly that we're seeing now, with families who are struggling to afford a good diet, we're seeing now people having to extract their own teeth because they can't afford to pay for the dentist. This is absolutely crazy. Nico, did you want to come in?
Yeah, about the data and its uses, and talking about identifying expensive patients. There was an article in the Mirror, when was it, last year, before, about a US private healthcare firm handed £7 million NHS contract to rank patients, and that's what they're doing. And you know, every time you have these wonks talking about integrated care, accountable care, they're always saying you need data for this, you need data. And yes, you do need to classify the unprofitable patients and try and do your best to keep them out of hospital, expensive hospital. And that's done within Medicare in the US, which is really where this, you know, the model has been the model for the UK. I remember an article on the Standard a few years ago, and there was a talk about people from a local NHS body going on a trip to the US, a fact-finding mission to part of their work. And they said, what you do? Oh, don't worry, this is about Medicare. It's not about, you know, private insurance. Like, that's okay. But really, Medicare and you know, accountable care, integrated care, this system of incentives to reduce the care is used within the state-funded services in the US, and they're kept to a minimum, which means that, you know, beyond that, those who are covered, you know, some people are covered for some things. It's the exact opposite of the NHS, which covered everybody for everything, and so that pushes you to go private. Michael Moore talks about it in the film Sicko. He says, you know, after this became law under Nixon, was also in Bob's film, the you know, health provision reduced, and private healthcare grew. So they're definitely doing that, and it's population health management, often presented as like a question of dealing with the health of the collective of the population, but it's actually about classifying according to who is profitable, who isn't, and who you should make efforts to marginalize and keep from using too many services by, you know, finding ways to keep them out of hospital. So that's not a maybe, that's part of integrated, so-called integrated care. Yeah.
Did I see another hand up just now?
I think I put mine up kind of semi-intentionally. I was just playing around, really. But I mean, there's always something to say. I mean, we've touched on so many different aspects. It's. I mean, this is one of the problems: is you're in this, you know, smoke and mirrors world through the looking glass, and it's you know, it's very hard to know anymore what's north or south or up and down. And I mean, I think the key points that have just been touched on. One of them was certainly the kind of the current model of modern or 21st century capitalism is very much this model of siphoning wealth. So using public funds or taxpayer funds as a way of just siphoning huge profits, and that's really the driving force behind financialization, privatization, outsourcing. We've seen it with PFI a long time ago. So the UK now has debts of over 300 billion, and that's money that goes straight to the City of London, something that's rarely mentioned in these debates. Bob obviously highlighted them earlier. We've seen obviously the outsourcing across the public sector, Serco, G4S, in the NHS, of course, and financialization. We've seen that in the housing market, particularly in global capitals, but it's the same trends really everywhere. And we've seen, of course, with the COVID crisis, whereby we had a test and trace operation that's been outsourced to the tune of £37 billion over 2 years, and that goes to companies such as Deloitte, Serco, Sodexo. And when you turn up at, as most of the population has at some point, to these testing centres, I went on 2 occasions. I was astonished that the actual staff working there were oblivious to this, and I just pretended to play dumb, and I asked a couple of them at the local walk-in centre. I said, who's running this? And they said, oh, it's the government. And then at another test centre in Coventry, a drive-through one, I asked the same question and was told that it was the NHS. And I had to kind of obviously correct them and say, no, it's not. And at the second centre, I said, who's really running it? And in the first example, genuinely the person didn't know. In the second one, they treated it as if it was something top secret. And he kind of said in hushed tones, oh, it's Sodexo. As if he was, as if this was a danger. Maybe he could lose his job over that. I don't know, but that's the situation, and that's one of the key points. I think the second key point that Nico has highlighted is of course that this move towards US type healthcare, and in the US they're actually obviously having a very lively debate right now about trying to get away from how appalling their healthcare system is at the time, where we are moving in that direction. And of course, you get this very disingenuous line from free market think tanks, such as, I'm trying to remember some of the names. We haven't done all of this stuff for so long now that we've been depoliticized ourselves, but maybe Bob or Nico can remind me of some of the names. But you get this kind of classic line, disingenuous line that basically, but you keep banging on about the US healthcare system, but that's not the only model. You can reform the NHS into a European system. But of course, what's on the table when you look at Jeremy Hunt's statements to the Health Select Committee when he was Health Secretary, when you look at Simon Stevens's reforms in his whole CV, that integrated care is very much a US healthcare model. There's lots of others, but lots of other things to say, but I'll probably wrap it up for now.
Kailash, have you got your hands up there?
Yes, I think very few, 5-6 minutes are left. My perhaps request to all of us is, if this reform goes through, this is all a recipe for privatization, NHS will be destroyed. With their majority of 80, it's very likely will go through. I think, what's the way forward? We need the might of the public. We need the muscle of the staff to somehow stop it. So I would want to perhaps hear from these learned people in a couple of minutes. What do they think is the way forward? Because we all know what exactly is happening or what will happen to NHS. I think the purpose of the real good thing will come out of it, that we have some strategy that how do we fight it.
Who wants to go first? Nico?
Yeah, I won't claim to be a brilliant strategist or anything remotely like that, but I definitely feel that we need to drop out of the habits of campaigning. Like talking with a bunch of people about what to do about this. Well, what should we put on the leaflets? Well, nobody said we were going to make any leaflets. Why would there be any leaflets? There's a lot of campaigning has acted as though we're talking about sort of limited damage. Basically, there are underlying questions like, why is the UK boss of the US Medicare provider, perhaps the largest one, why is she moved into Downing Street to advise Johnson? Why did we have the CEO of United Health running NHS England? Why has NHS England, so many of its directors come to or from a variety of these companies? Who put these people in charge? We didn't elect them. Nobody voted to have a US system instead of the National Health Service, however progressively it's been introduced. And so those are fundamental democratic questions, and they're outside of whether or not your local urgent care center, which is designed for profit. You've got people who are fighting to keep an urgent care center in public hands. It was made to be profited from. That's why it's not an A&E, and it just does minor, treats minor ailments because that's profitable. That's why it exists. So you're barking up the wrong tree if you're just trying to keep that in public hands, because it's not even, you should have an A&E locally. Learn what the NHS brought all these services regardless of profit, and that is what's being pushed out of the way. So I just think we need to be, our reaction needs to be proportional to what's at hand. This is about corporate power over our politics and over the basic decisions in our lives.
Yes.
We as a country shouldn't allow that. As a population, shouldn't allow them to take over our right to decide.
Mm.
I couldn't agree more, Nico. I mean, one of the people that you mentioned there in that list of people who are unelected and imposed because they've been selected rather than elected, Sir Simon Stevens. And I found out earlier today that I knew he was stepping down from the NHS this summer. But he's actually also just been awarded a life peerage from the Queen, which of course means that he now goes and sits in the upper chamber, which is the final hurdle for any NHS legislation to get over before it happens. Previously, now I've got problems with an unelected upper chamber, first of all, because I think it should be a democratic process, not someone that's there because they're mates with someone or because they've done someone else a favour. That is completely unacceptable. However, previously with NHS legislation, the House of Lords have actually stepped in and stopped some of the worst parts of legislation. If we've got people like Sir Simon Stevens sitting on those green benches, red benches, making a decision on what's going to happen with these bills, they're rather marking their own homework, aren't they?
I'm sure that's intentional to put in there. So yes.
Indeed. Did you want to answer more to what Kailash said, Bob?
Yeah, I think our biggest obstacle is lack of public awareness, and lack of pressure on our leaders, be that our union leaders, be that our political leaders, be that leaders in any capacity, professional representative bodies. The vast majority of them are quietly going along with this, and they need to be held to account and put on the spot and explain to them what exactly they're part of. They are part of selling out the interests of the nation for their own likely personal gain at some point. So we have to get a very clear message across to as many of the public as possible. I think the time for direct action, peaceful civil disobedience is upon us. We can't wait for another election to get Starmer into power, which seems very remote, for him to carry on with business as usual. And Nico's point is very, very strong. We have a fight for democracy. Do we want to be a corporatocracy where decisions are made behind our backs by billionaires and millionaires? That's what we've got at the moment. We need to reclaim our democracy, and people need to see it as a fundamental threat to their own survival, what is taking place at the moment.
Brilliant. You're absolutely right. I'm right there with you, Bob. How about you, Yusuf? Did you want to come into Kailash's points?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Bob's highlighted, the first point, there's two aspects to any political question. The first is to identify what the problem is before the second part of trying to come up with a solution, which is more difficult. So in terms of public awareness, public understanding, the key point is understanding in summary, because we've talked about so many different things. In summary, the NHS, universal public healthcare in this country, has been under attack for decades. It's been gradually dismantled. It is now at the final stage of marketization, which would take it towards a US healthcare system. What does that look like? It means that it is broken up into 44 or 42. I thought it was 44. I don't know if that's changed, but 40 something, let's say, footprints or regions in which you will have a lead provider subcontracting to other providers, and in which those either main regional health and social care contracts or the other subcontracted ones are basically going to be run by private companies, increasingly, to the point where, as Bob has identified, that could be actually a majority or even 100% outsourcing or private provision, with your tax money just reduced to a funding stream, basically. So that's the problem in a nutshell. The the solution now, that is a symptom that we can't save the NHS in isolation. It's an island now, right now. It's an oasis in a world of global capitalism, of extreme deregulated free market capitalism. That cannot be saved on its own. So the NHS can only be saved as part of a much wider movement that is fighting for reversing these things. So reversing privatisation across the board, reversing low taxation, reversing corporate control, of course, of democracy, which is the biggest factor of all, reversing financial control of our society, the control of our society by financialized capitalism. So all of these things which are happening, and that concentration of wealth and power, that plutocracy, that billionaires, the billionaires, that is controlling our democracy through lobbying, through donations, funding, through the revolving door. Now, to reverse that, historically, the only way is through a mass movement. You need grassroots, mass mobilization of people. And there's a lot of people out there right now who we know from the Brexit results of the campaigns, we know from the Trump result, we know from the kind of populist movements, both on the right and the left, there's a lot of disenfranchisement, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration. The question is how that's going to be channeled, because right now it's largely one of the legacies of neoliberalism over 4 decades has been that it has basically hollowed out institutions, it's hollowed out government, it's hollowed out the media, it's hollowed out the academic sphere, and so the response, in spite of the fact that it is in a perpetual crisis since 2008, is that there has been little resistance. And in fact, the flurry of, the hope, the brief ray of hope we had with progressive movements such as, Bernie Sanders, such as Corbyn, some of that has been snuffed out. And of course, there's always still going to be a struggle that continues forever. But the question is how this is going to be channeled, and whether, in fact, if things continue as they are, and if there's another economic crisis, whether we're going to be heading down a very dark road. So this is a choice for people, and it's going to take a humongous. It's going to take a huge. I don't know if that's not even a real word, is it? It's me spending too much time with the little ones. But yeah, it's going to take a massive effort in terms of all kinds of things to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. I mean, as well as the removal of what's called Section 75, which we covered earlier in this new bill, we're seeing the creation of bodies which can have the directors of private healthcare companies sat on the board deciding what contracts they were going to award to whom. Now, at the moment, there's this trend to criticise the Tory government for what they call cronyism. As far as I'm concerned, it's not cronyism, it's out and out corruption. And what this act will do is absolutely bake that corruption in. And we need to remember that these contracts are awarded not just for 12 months or 24 months, some of them are awarded for up to 15 years. This act, if it goes through, will be the end of the NHS as we know it, as far as I'm concerned. So, just to round up.
And this is, sorry, buddy, to jump in. This is already happening. It's not theoretical, it's not hypothetical. In places like Nottingham and Nottinghamshire, I think, and Dudley, the actual contracts to bring about this transition have already been handed to these multinationals and these, American private healthcare companies. And we've seen that obviously with the GP network that was sold to Sentient. So none of this is theoretical, just for the audience, really.
No, absolutely, it is happening right now. But what this bill will do is seal it in. It's going to bake in all of the things that are dangerous to our NHS and make them the norm. It is increasingly the norm at the moment, but we need to stand up against that. Now, the process for parliamentary legislation is that it needs to have a first reading and a second reading in Westminster, which it's had. It completed and passed the second reading last week. The next phase is to go through the House of Lords. And having watched that debate, I am ashamed to say that I had to look at the name of the person speaking during the debate and to find out whether they were Labour or Conservative, which is just unforgivable. It's not good enough. So the bottom line is our MPs need educating. Our neighbours and our friends need to be told and shown what's happening here. So if you're going to do 3 things today to save your NHS, I would like you, first of all, to write to the people at the top of your trade union, to write to your MP, and to write to any of the lords that you have any contact with. You can get all email addresses off the internet, and ask to demand actually that they take a stand to protect our publicly provided NHS and prevent this bill from going any further. The next thing I would like you to do is tell your neighbours. And also there are countless campaign groups up and down. This is mostly happening in England. So there are campaign groups attached to most of the hospitals around the country. And I would strongly urge people to go and get in touch with those local campaign groups, because they are protecting the services that you need in your area. Please get involved. Please spread the word. Please make sure this doesn't go any further. Thank you very much to all of our guests this evening. It's been really good hearing from you and getting your professional insight. Till we meet again, thanks for watching. Good night.